I'm with Marios Koutsoukos, my first guest, soon after the podcast started officially close to New Year's Eve of 2020. Marios is a PhD candidate in history of religions in the late antiquity at the University of Liverpool, a history enthusiast and lifelong scholar, as an epic fiction novelist bilingual author, and a graduate of the National and Capodistrian University of Athens in the French language and literature, and a Masters of Arts holder in creative writing from the Hellenic Open University. Marios, since 2004, has been involved in the international metal music scene, writing lyrics and developing concepts for bands in Greece and worldwide. In his own words, much like a bass player, he cannot be considered a proper musician, but rather someone who hangs out with artists. Marios, as mentioned before, is not new to the Global Greek Influence podcast. He was my first guest in the episode Battles in History and Life No Regrets, where we saw how battles in history teach us about living a life with no regrets. In the episode Beyond Time and Technology, when the pandemic started, by looking into the perception of pandemics across fictional literature as an opportunity to reveal our true selves and finding our purpose versus being consumed by events. The 200 years from the 1821 War of Independence of the Hellenes episode about the role of the Phil-Hellenes and the big powers of those times, the impact of classicism, and that of Hellenism of the 19th century to the post-war of independence Greece. Also, Marios was my guest for the episodes The Past Defines Us, The Romans and Propaganda versus the Hellenes, parts 1 and 2, on the crucial role of the Roman Empire where today's misconceptions of reality, everyday life find their roots, Roman manipulation of the Greek Hellenic culture, how principles of the ancient Greek culture are used and applied today. Marios spoke about the philosophy and religion of Platonic Outlook's description episode with a focus on the philosophical schools and trends in late antiquity adopted by the Romans to form early Christianity. And last year, when we met for the last time in the episode The Past Defines Us, the end of philosophy and the beginning of the Middle Ages, the Byzantines. To listen to more exciting guests and a unique perspective on current and timeless matters, please subscribe, like, and leave your comments to the Global Greek Influence podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and 6 more podcasting platforms, in addition to the podcast Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn accounts, as well as to the podcast website, globalgreekinfluence.com. Welcome to the show, Maria, again.
Well met, Panayota. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for your invitation. It really feels like home. I mean, now that you enumerated all my previous appearances on the show, I just think to myself, when did we do all those very stimulating and interesting talks? I mean, it's great to be back.
As the title of this episode suggests, we will discuss the link between the metal music scene and the Greek history and mythology. And I would like also to add here that this is going to be another exciting discussion as the ones we had before through the platform of the podcast. And thank you once again, Maria, for accepting my invitation. I mentioned all previous episodes with you on purpose, because especially those related to Greece and its culture, it has been underlined that our Greek heritage has been interpreted through many recent and older contexts. But we always try to shed light on perceptions and misconceptions and bring objectivity, of course, to the extent of our subjectivity. Yet I hope the questions and background information I use in my questions to the guests approach objectivity. Most metal music fans know that the genre is highly influenced by history, mythology, and the figures portrayed in them. To the Greek audience, Flight of Icarus and Alexander the Great by Iron Maiden are most well known. In a sense, metal music lyrically retells myths and history. In the case of Flight of Icarus, Iron Maiden delivers the myth of Icarus through Ovid's Metamorphosis. Again, through the Romans, we know more about the history of Alexander III of Macedon, whom the Romans characterized as great. As in The Past Defines Us, the Romans and Propaganda versus the Hellenes, parts 1 and 2 episodes with you, Maria, we saw the retelling of history and philosophy through Roman telling or retelling. Today, we will explore the retelling of Greek history and mythology through metal music. Why is heavy metal inspired by Greek history and mythology?
Thank you very much for laying the groundwork for me, and of course for mentioning those great songs. I believe every metalhead's first contact with ancient Greek culture must have been Alexander the Great or Flight of Icarus by Iron Maiden. Alexander the Great is one of my all-time favorite songs in any case, but this deep connection between heavy metal and classical Greek myth or history, sometimes both, I believe comes from the relationship between metal being a genre born in the West and the classicism that is predominant in the West. So thinking that classical Greek myths and classical Greek history has been teaching and shaping the ideas about the world and about history in the Western world, it is only natural that a music genre created by this culture would be rather heavily influenced by Greek culture. At the same time, Greek myth and history do have some incredibly badass moments, some incredibly epic moments, some incredibly shocking moments, moments with shock value, like Hercules fighting the centaurs, the Argonauts setting sail to grab the golden fleece, the Trojan War. So heavy metal, being by its nature a badass and kind of provocative genre of music, would by default and by nature be drawn to those themes. And in a sense, those themes of classical antiquity and classical mythology do give, let's say, an excuse to tell stories of war, of mayhem, of bloodshed, of magic, of mythical creatures, to tell all those stories by maintaining also, let's say, a level of nuanced intellectual prowess on the part of the musician. Therefore, in metal, I think all the musicians who choose to deal with those subjects do so in a way that kind of makes them feel proud of what they're doing, and rather delving deeper into the story and to the epic themes that metal deals with, rather than just writing a song about the ultimate warrior or some generic epic stuff like that. It's much better if it's Achilles. For instance, I would point out in Manowar's The Triumph of Steel album, there's a huge 30-minute song devoted to the Iliad. So there's even a like 5-minute drum solo called The Armor of Achilles, that it's a drum solo, if you can believe that, and it's about Hephaestus forging the new armor of Achilles. It's terrible. It's really bad. I mean, nobody can go through that, but still, from an artistic point of view, it's a drum solo inspired by the Iliad, so that's great. So that in a nutshell, that's how I understand the influence of classical myth in metal. These two have the same aesthetic that kind of fits. So basically, it's only natural that heavy metal is inspired by classical Greek myths.
I feel so lucky to have met you, Mario, because I don't think I would have found a better guest than you, who is both a classicist and who writes lyrics for heavy metal bands, also playing bass in metal bands. Since we are now in the field of ancient history and mythology, contrary to the ancient mainstream, including philosophical pro-Athenian concepts, Sparta stimulated Plato's Republic and Xenophon's Constitution of the Spartans, and could be considered a type of escapist fantasy following Socrates' execution. In the metal scene, we see at least 94 bands having one song of ancient Sparta. Why do we see such a preference?
That's actually a very good question. This Spartamania, shall we say? It is very common, especially in the heavy metal genre, to find albums dedicated to almost exclusively the Spartans. And just as in antiquity, this sort of Spartan bravado, this fame that the Spartans had as being the ultimate warriors of the ancient world, which was, yeah, it was based in truth. There was truth to it, but it's kind of a hype as well. It's a bit blown out of proportion, but that fits perfectly again with the excessiveness of the heavy metal genre. It fits well with its willingness to go above and beyond and to portray the ultimate warrior in an excessive and highly romanticized light. And this sort of romanticization, I want to say, I'm not entirely sure about this word. Anyway, this sort of approach, this sort of romantic approach towards ancient Sparta is, as you said, something that goes a long way back into antiquity. For instance, Plato and Xenophon, being a mercenary himself and a great military commander, was very much in awe and admired the Spartan constitution. Plato, on the other hand, on the same page, being on the same page, did mention that of all the Greeks, it's the Spartans who are the true philosophers because they speak very little and they act. So throughout history, throughout the Greek history, Spartans have been admired for their warlike spirit and their simplicity. And heavy metal is, in essence, one of some of its most fundamental themes is the warlike theme, the martial theme, if you will, and the fundamentally male, simple way of life that overcomes all adversity. So in that sense, yes, Sparta would be the poster boy, the darling boy of heavy metal. At the same time, in history, you have some of the greatest badass moments in history carried out by the Spartans. For instance, the Battle of Thermopylae. One of the bands I've worked with, Sacred Blood, a Greek band, they do have an album entirely dedicated to the Battle of Thermopylae. Didn't write the lyrics to that myself, though it is a great album. I really do enjoy that, especially Blades in the Night. It's a great song. But in any case, yeah, the Battle of Thermopylae has been done to death. I mean, pretty much every single band that has dealt in ancient Greek history, they has done a song about Thermopylae. I myself have written a song about Thermopylae. Probably I have. Most probably I have written something about that, but it must be one of those folk earth or folk odia songs that I totally forget. I mean, I've totally lost count of my discography at this point, but pretty much, yeah, every band has done that. Now, of course, you do have some bands that, use Sparta as a vehicle to express some political ideas. We'll get to that later. But yeah, indeed, Sparta does hold a fascination, just like the US Marines or the Navy SEALs hold a fascination to the general public, or the Russian Spetsnaz, or, extreme fighting forces being the prototype for people being disciplined and overcoming all adversity. And heavy metal is pretty much about being able to overcome all adversity in an epic and kick-ass way. So why not Sparta?
We will come back to the masculinity promoted through heavy metal music, especially and broadly in the metal scene, but we will stick to the history part of the metal music, which retells ancient mythology and history, most often sourcing historical and literature references by adding lyrical elements. In the case of more recent historical events, one might refer to the Sabaton's coat of arms, which refers to the Greco-Italian War declared on 28th of October 1940. How does heavy metal influence our perception of classic times, also more recent historical events?
Actually, another great song, Coat of Arms by Sabaton. And just to jump back on the previous question, yes, Sabaton do have a song about Sparta as well, because you can't be in heavy metal and deal in history and not have a song about Sparta. But for instance, Sabaton is a great example of a band that deals in historical events and almost exclusively, well, basically exclusively on military history. So right there, you see this mixing of epic power metal with military history. And to be honest, a song can never entirely cover the whole objective view of history. So when there's a song about a historical event, it will be biased. It will be a brief description of the historical event it approaches, and it will never be entirely accurate. It has to be romanticized. It has to be idealized. Otherwise, it would be a boring song, actually. That's something, actually, there's a funny story about that. I'll tell it later on. But When it comes to writing lyrics about history, you have to kind of romanticize the whole narrative and create, let's say, a narrative where there's the good guys and the bad guys, regardless of whether you believe that as the lyricist, but that's how it works. For instance, there's this lack of historical, let's say, references and bibliography in modern metal songs. That's why you often get songs that are entirely distorted and sometimes used to promote a political agenda or somebody's perceived notion of history. Let be said that last February, I actually attended a lovely conference entitled Heavy Metal and Pre-Modernity, hosted by Charlotte Davis and Jeremy Swiss at Brandeis University. It's the Heavy Metal and Pre-Modernity concert. Woo! So as part of that, I actually, because this question weighed heavy on my mind, how would it be to have an actual historically accurate metal song? That's why I wrote a song as the lyrics, and I had a good friend of mine, Grego Mixmaster. We worked together in a band called Downcast Twilight. So we wrote a Viking metal song with historical references, so as it would be the world's first historically accurate heavy metal song. I'm not sure if you're following the insane idea of it so far, but the idea is to actually have song lyrics that have actual bibliographical references and reflect antiquity in a, let's say, academic light, in a not exaggerated and not romanticized way. The outcome is up to the public to judge, to be honest. My idea was that it would be really boring, and although we did have fun with it, and that is why, to address the other bit of your question, that is why heavy metal does influence our perception of history. Exactly because it is idealized, it's romanticized, and nobody wants to listen to the historically accurate stuff that I write. But that sort of stuff, the idealized sort of stuff, does hit the listener on the emotional level. And as you know, people do like and are convinced, to be honest, they're more convinced by emotions than they are convinced by logic. Therefore, when Sabaton played in Greece, was it in June? No, sorry, it must have been late July. Yeah, when they played Coat of Arms, from what I heard, I wasn't in Greece, alas. But yeah, the crowd went crazy, exactly because they actually, let's say, stimulated on an emotional level. So yes, heavy metal being heavily emotional, romanticized, and does get a response. That can be either bad or good. Depends. If you just stick to what heavy metal has taught you about history, then you just have a very superficial perception of history. But on the other hand, heavy metal and bands like Sabaton can be a great gateway, let's say, experience to actually learning history. And that's why I love bands that deal in history, exactly because they give their audience a stimulus for further research. So in conclusion, heavy metal does influence, the perception of its crowd. And at this point, we should know that heavy metal is kind of a niche genre. It's not like it's pop music or has a huge audience. But as far as its audience is concerned, sure, it does exercise quite a lot of influence in the regards that they see history. But in my experience, that gives metalheads also a good excuse or a good, let's say, inspiration and a good prompt to actually research history. For instance, listening to songs about the Celts, about Vikings, about the ancient Slavs and all that, that really did inspire me to actually do my own research further on. And that's exactly what I'm also trying to do with my lyrics, to actually give people this prompt and this same gift that I received from bands that, dealt superficially with historical themes.
A couple of remarks in your last answer, Maria. First of all, when we talk about political influence in a music scene, or a music scene influencing a political audience, it wouldn't be the first time that politics utilize arts. As if one claims that heavy metal, for instance, promotes nationalism, which is going to be one of my following questions, if this is something that really the metal music promotes, or if metal music has been utilized by nationalist parties and nationalist audiences. On the other hand, when it comes to portraying with accuracy historical events, it's not always an easy case. And I know that from a research point of view. Being a chemical engineer, I know that if one claims that he had specific outcomes, I can repeat their experiments to see if this is true. Even if I find the description of experiments that happened 100 years ago, I can repeat them. But we cannot do the same with history. We cannot relive history, and we cannot really go back in time to actually live history. This is why it was very important to emphasize at the beginning that we know about the myth of Icarus, that Iron Maiden were inspired for writing their Flight of Icarus, but that was through Ovid's perception and writing. We don't know what the actual myth of Icarus was about in ancient Greek times, or we know mostly about Alexander III of Macedon, whom the Romans called Alexander the Great through Roman script. So when we talk about accuracy in historical events, we should be very careful, because we know that we read history through sources who had specific objectives and lenses and perceptions and interpretations for us to read today what we use, even for historical analysis or for historical lessons. In 2019, the first anti-fascist extreme metal show in New York occurred partially because of the National Socialist black metal bands, which still comprise only a small percentage of metal music. Metal fans have started to discuss politics that mirror the broader metal culture. As we have already addressed the retelling of history and mythology by metal bands, one might say that such narratives glorify past events and symbolisms. So has nationalism been promoted by heavy metal music, or have nationalists utilized heavy metal music?
Yeah, actually, that's one of the things, yeah, as I said earlier, that we need to address this issue as well. Just first, a quick remark on your remark on the remark. Of course, yeah, when we talk about historical accuracy as historians, we can never 100% recreate or give people a snapshot or a video recording of what happened in history. History is a narrative, after all, and it's a narrative that we try to academically and scientifically reconstruct, you know, based on sources and all that, but it's always up for debate and up for change. So yeah, when we talk about historical accuracy in heavy metal songs, we just mean Vikings not having horns on their helmets, that sort of thing, because, you know, Vikings didn't actually, the Norwegian or Swedish Vikings didn't have the actual, you know, horns on their helmets. Anyway, putting that aside as a remark on the remark, going back into your very good question about nationalism. Yes, indeed, you do have a small percentage, a minority, I would say, in heavy metal that are politicized bands, bands being politicized in the far right spectrum. And these bands try to push their ideologies using history, appropriating history, and especially classical Greek history. So when we talked about Sparta being this archetype of the kick-ass US Marines, Navy SEALs of the ancient world, as you can imagine, that sort of archetype would be very appealing to a national socialist. Of course, there remains the question, do national socialists listen to that sort of metal, or does that sort of metal with, let's say, Spartan references create national socialists? It's a difficult question to answer, really. I mean, on a certain level, yes, National Socialists would be driven and attracted to metal due to its marching rhythms, its martial themes, its warlike nature, its overflowing masculinity kind of situation. Somebody who on the political spectrum is on the far right would be attracted to the whole genre of epic, historically based heavy metal. On the other hand, epic, historically based heavy metal does not by default mean that you are a far right supporter. In Greece, as you may also recall, from that period between 2012 and 2018, when we had the rise of the far-right Golden Dawn Party, then there was this sort of hysteria going around in the Greek world, in the Greek heavy metal world, to be honest, where if you even so much as touched on the subject of a hoplite, of Alexander the Great, of Spartans, or even of Greek mythology, oh, you were a fascist, believe it. And that was really strange, because I think at the time we had released with Sacred Blood the album Alexandros, referring it was a concept album. And a couple of years after that, we released another album with Sacred Blood, Argonautica, based on Jason and the Argonauts. And none of us were supporters of the extreme far right or anything like that, but at the same time, these albums were very coldly accepted, received by the Greek heavy metal public, because it was like, oh, they're fascists, they deal with ancient Greek history. So actually, the attraction of the far right to heavy metal has, in my opinion and my experience, has actually damaged and harmed, the artists that very honestly and with a love of history and with a love for their own culture do approach those things. So this appropriation of classical antiquity by the far right is indeed something, well, to be expected and toxic, and that's why we jump again to the subject of historical accuracy. For instance, all these politicized bands, they do not care about the historical accuracy. They care about the narrative that supports their views. For instance, to give you an example, the Golden, who really played heavy metal and supported the nationalist cause, and therefore they quite liked the archetype of the Spartan warrior, the ultimate man. But me, as a classicist, I wonder if they had read Philostratus, the life of Apollonius of Tyana, when in the 1st century, Philostratus comes to Sparta, and he's greeted by Spartan messengers who want to, have him as a sage from Cappadocia, have him speak and spread his wisdom to Sparta. But the good Apollonius, being a very conservative Cappadocian sage and a Pythagorean, he notices that the Spartan envoys have sleek limbs, they have waxed their whole bodies, and they are very, perfumed and all that in the 1st century. So in the historical record, we can see that the Spartan warriors of Thermopylae, as time progressed in the 1st century, they became much more relaxed, not the kind of man that a National Socialist, a modern National Socialist would like to see. And National Socialists choose to disregard the fact that Spartans were very much in cahoots and very sympathizing towards the Persians. They served as mercenaries in the Persian infantry, just like Athenians served as mercenaries in the Persian navy. And in general, they did have quite a good relationship with the Persians. That's why they refused to fight alongside Alexander the Great in his invasion of the Persian Empire. So all these little uncomfortable truths, let's say, these uncomfortable historical accuracies, to use this rather general term that we introduced, would be quite a turn down for the National Socialists. That's why extreme far right supporters, or to be honest, anyone who is heavy on politics and heavy metal, they focus very specifically on certain traits of history that they want to produce. Now, does that create a problem? Aside from the problem I mentioned, ruining it for everybody else, or ruining it for people who just like the music and just like the history, I don't think it creates a huge problem, because the average person is not really interested in, jumping on board the political bandwagon that these people are promoting. And to be honest, if anybody is leaning towards such extreme ideologies, they would end up there one way or another. I don't think heavy metal is the deciding factor in that, to be honest. And in my personal experience, for instance, I love this band Nocturnal Mortum. They're a Ukrainian band. I listened to them for quite a few years, and then only then I discovered that they're actually very staunch National Socialist supporters. This was quite a bummer, but their music still remains good music, and it's mostly in Ukrainian, so I didn't understand what I was listening to. But, sometimes people can just stick to the music and enjoy the music. if that's their cup of tea. For me, it doesn't really work that way. I mean, I kind of get kind of iffy about supporting such bands, but still, I don't think heavy metal does play such a huge role in politics. I think pop music or other more popular and widespread genres are much more efficient tools in spreading political ideas and propaganda.
As it was mentioned before, it wouldn't be the first time that arts are utilized in scope of a political narrative. And of course, most of the times, such narratives are cherry-picked. In the broader current social context, metal music has become a subject of equality studies too. According to Zimmerman's and West's social theory of doing gender, gender is behavior. On the other hand, Heidi Reitmacher suggests that metal music is undoing gender in the sense that women behave more masculine to avoid the overly sexualized context of the metal scene. Under this prism, how are femininity and masculinity seen in the metal scene, as the aforementioned scholars argue that metal music is doing gender, while others indicate it is undoing gender?
Metal, if we're talking about statistics, is a predominantly male musical genre. I don't think it's by choice. I think it kind of just happened. But I mean, statistically speaking, most bands are made up of men, and most of the audience is male. So if you go to a metal concert, you will see a predominance of men on stage, men on the mosh pit, men everywhere. We do have some very colorful words about that in the Greek metal scene, but they're not appropriate for this show. So moving on. However, I definitely don't see metal as being sexist or excluding women. For instance, especially in the last 10, 20 years, you do have a very strong female presence in metal, like front women in bands and even solo acts. To be honest, in my personal experience, I've worked with some amazing female metal artists who are great, even when it comes to brutal vocals or soprano vocals or playing keyboards, playing guitars. And also, I think the band Tristessa in Greece was the first worldwide, actually, female-only black metal band. So Greece does have this, let's say, originality in creating a female, all-female black metal band. However, metal does have this sort of 80s aesthetic. So it has this 80s romantic approach towards its aesthetic. So it's always the guy on the big heavy metal motorcycle and the girl on the back. That has to do more, I think, with an outdated kind of aesthetic that is combined with the prevalence of men. But still, metal does portray women in a very favorable light. I mean, there are, I can recall, bands dedicating whole albums to Zenobia, portraying her as the warrior queen that she is. Personally, I've written at least a couple of songs about Telesila of Argos and the Pythagorean women that stood up to the tyrant of Samos and all that. And Boudica as well is a favorite figure of heavy metal themes, as the warrior queen who stands up to the Romans and faces their legions. So when it comes to historically inspired heavy metal, women do play an important role. Of course, since history traditionally is written by men, and focusing more on the deeds of men, the historical sources available do marginalize women. Therefore, metal influenced by history gives a prevalence to men, but that is not due to a sexism in heavy metal. To be honest, I've never encountered anybody sexist in the heavy metal scene myself, in my personal experience, nor do I think it's actually possible, to be honest, exactly because there are relatively few women in the metal scene. They are greeted with quite open arms. I'm thinking now 20 years ago, but since those 20 years, nobody bats an eye to a female-fronted band or even an all-female heavy metal band. So I think matters of gender in heavy metal are more likely to be goaded in the artwork and in the expression by a retro kind of aesthetic, if you will, rather than sexism or separation of genres by choice and with a whole philosophy to back it up. So it's more of a, let's say, antiquated kind of 80s or 90s approach to the whole men, women kind of issue. And, you know, when you have the big muscular warrior, it's not like the metalheads are big and muscular, nor are the women in metal scantily clad in chainmail bikinis. You know, that's just an artistic interpretation. It's not a conscious choice of how I want to see the world.
I haven't read in detail the social theory of Zimmerman and West about doing gender, who they consider that gender is behavior. But based on my interpretation, I would agree with that theory that gender can be predominantly determined, in a sense, based on behavior and not vice versa. For instance, I started to listen to metal music when I was 10 years old. And I was always excited to read about the heroism found throughout history, even though there were not any female model roles. Of course, I became aware of the whole history of the Amazons that was more like a myth. Then I came across Queen Cleopatra, who was demonized by Romans. And then I wonder, do we really have the history as it happened and we read today, or is everything through the Roman lenses? And this is why I asked you to do that episode regarding Romans propagandizing the Hellenic philosophical heritage, scientific one, even military one, and historically. I don't really believe that history has been quite favorable towards women, female figures. At the same time, I would say that when I listened to metal music, or even when I was present in a metal concert, I never really felt I had to suppress my femininity, because I'm a highly intellectual person, and to me, most things are perceived by mental mechanisms and processes. So the whole idea of heroism maybe was something that I was attracted to. So I never really saw any need for me to follow the metal scene, that I had to denounce my physical appearance. And yet my physical appearance is not always aligned with my behavior as it is defined by genders today. And this leads us to our final question, Myriam. Apart from the initial examples of metal songs inspired by Greek mythology and history, the American band Virgin Steel produced 2 albums based on Aeschylus or Hestia, while Symphony X, a progressive metal band with strong essence of classical music, produced songs based on Greek mythology and literature, including the Odyssey. We also do not often see bands in the full spectrum of the metal scene engage with day-to-day reality material. Could we say escapism is essential to metal music, and why?
Well, you just mentioned one of my all-time favorite bands, Virgin Steel, and David DeFay is quite a genius, the frontman and songwriter of the band and also singer. And these 2 albums, The Fall of the House of Atreus, Act 1 and Act 2, are incredible examples of metal meeting classical antiquity and actually classical Greek tragedy. And at the same time, that's jump back to what we were saying before about being able to be yourself and express yourself in a metal concert. Yes, that is my experience and my feeling from the heavy metal music scene, be it a concert, fellow musicians, or working on a project, that heavy metal, and especially historically inspired heavy metal, embraces everybody. It's like a big family, and you can be pretty much whatever you want without shame, without being judged. And the more badass you are at it, the better you are. So Amazons welcome, just like barbarians are welcome, you know. It's that sort of thing. But this leads us to the next part of your question about escapism. Why does heavy metal so often deal with such issues that belong to mythology or to history or to a time long gone? Sure, of course, you do have a lot of metal genres dealing with contemporary issues, but there's quite a big chunk of the heavy metal genre that is fixated, let's say, on escapism, on the idea of the good old days. And may I mention another great album by my favorite band, Virgin Steel, Noble Savage. So that's actually, in two words, the quintessence of heavy metal's escapism, going back to the noble savage, to this idealized ancient past that everything was nobler. And that is, I think, part of the appeal and the allure of heavy metal, that it refers to themes and to stories and to myths that reflect this freedom through not conforming in the norms. Keep in mind that heavy metal is actually an extreme, a marginal, let's say, type of genre, in the sense that rock and roll was once. Nowadays, sure, pretty much everything is mainstream, and heavy metal is seeing a new rise in popularity after the last season of Stranger Things, which, by the way, was great, but that's neither here nor there. And yeah, so heavy metal is totally dominated by escapism, especially the black metal and the power heavy metal genre is dominated by escapism because it either wants to speak about the modern world in metaphors drawn from classical antiquity, drawn from myth, and use the archetypes of heroes or even ancient literary figures to reflect on strong emotions. As we mentioned earlier, heavy metal is all about the emotion. Escapism is the way to do it. You really don't get that much of a strong emotional response when you talk about everyday stuff, at least in a powerful and, let's say, extreme genre as heavy metal is. So I would say, yeah, it's escapism is an integral part of heavy metal because it's part of the magic. It's part of this step further, this step beyond all the boring, mundane stuff, and it's part of the magic of heavy metal. To be honest, it's part of the magic that really transforms you, and that's why you have so many die-hard metal fans throughout their lives. I mean, that's how the magic works.
Thank you, Maria, for accepting for the 7th time the invitation to the Global Greek Influence podcast and discussing the metal music in the Greek history and mythology and vice versa.
Thank you very much. 7th time went by before I even knew it. Have fun and hope to see you soon.
Stay tuned for another podcast episode every 2 Sundays on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and 6 more podcasting platforms. For more exciting live stream interviews, subscribe to the YouTube channel Yota Pimenidou and hit the notification button. Until next time.